YouTube or Zoom chat, and they'll be passed on to all of us at the panel. Let me just briefly sort of give an overview of the topic before I hand it over to Daniel and Erin as our first speakers. Again, the origin of this topic, I think, comes from a broad consensus that we've seen a sharp rise in the use of quantitative data across the social sciences in the last, say, half century, since the 1960s, certainly, and especially within the social sciences, which focus on nationalism and ethnicity, specifically political science, sociology, and history. I should even say even a bit in anthropology, especially American anthropology, has become more quantitative in this time period. You can see this as well in the study of ethnicity and nationalism. You look at the sort of older classic works from an earlier generation. I'm thinking of people like Anderson, Benedict Anderson, Karl Deutsch, Ernest Gellner, LSE's own late Anthony Smith. That work was entirely qualitative. And I think there's a newer generation of scholars who've come up since the 1980s and 1990s, including Andreas, who's going to speak later, but also people like David Layton, who've used a lot more quantitative work, research in their work. Now, of course, it's also due to the fact, a major reason why this has happened is because of the nature of data itself in terms of this topic. Older quantitative work, such as it existed, really relied upon census data quite a lot, which is, of course, highly political. If you think of the fact that certain countries do and certain countries don't collect data on ethnic identity. Myself, as an Africanist, the obvious examples are Rwanda and Tanzania, who haven't collected data on ethnicity for a long time. And in place of that, now we have a lot more data coming from surveys, for instance, from the Afro-Barometer, Latino Barometer, Asia Barometer, asking questions about ethnic and national identification and national pride. And we also have other surveys like the Demographic and Health Survey data. We also have, finally, we have big data, quote unquote, big data from some sources like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. So it's a lot to discuss. And I think one of the things that I think is something we can touch upon today is to what degree this has been a universally positive phenomenon or a mixed phenomenon, or there's pluses and minuses. And so I think there's a lot we can focus on today. And I'm going to stop now and hand it right over to Erin and Daniel.
Okay, thanks. I think I will take the lead on this team as we agreed with Daniel previously. So I think both of us were in agreement that quantitative measures and quantitative work has brought a lot to the study of ethnicity and nationalism. On the most basic level, it's needed because you need standardized snapshots across cases and over time in order to test theories about how and why identities vary and with what effects. And so to appreciate the contributions of quantitative scholars in this field, I find it helpful to think about where they have excelled and where they maybe fall short. And to help me in thinking about this, I went back to this book called Measuring Identity. Andreas mentioned it in his contribution. This is an edited volume edited by Abdullah, Harara, Johnston, and McDermott. It's fantastic. And in it, they lay out best practices for measuring identity. And in one of the chapters that I found very helpful, Henry Brady and Cynthia Kaplan enumerate 7 meanings of identity that should factor, in their view, into a more complete measure of identity. And I don't want to go into them in any amount of detail because, of course, not much time, but they cluster very broadly into 2 categories. One is related to kind of thin measures of identity, sort of ethnic and national identities. This includes categories, attributes, relations, attachment, positive and negative valuation. And in these areas, I think quantitative researchers have absolutely excelled. And of course, they're still pushing the boundaries forward. The second set of measures relate to more thicker measures, such as content of a group identity and social purpose of identity. And this is where I think quantitative work has lagged behind a bit. So just to briefly get into these. So the categories are basically sort of categories that are intersubjectively agreed upon for the basis of social identity. And these are basically used to construct all of the major cross-national databases that we're familiar with, including MAR, now the expanded ALL-MAR, the ethnic power relations data set that Andreas helped to found, ICOWS, and a number of other data sets, including obviously state census. And the bulk of the traditional quantitative work really is kind of founded on some kind of constructed measure of ethnic group or minority and the like. And then we also have attributes, right? And so these are the salient features, mostly the visible markers that are used to sort individuals into groups, ethnic groups and national groups. And these include religion, language or language used, region, custom, skin color, so the list that everyone sort of associates with Horowitz. And there are these cross-national databases like the data on ethno-linguistic groups in the former Soviet Union. And then there are also debates about whether you can use any particular attribute to construct a standardized measure of ethnic diversity across societies. And this is where, you know, there are debates around ELF, which I think Daniel will be talking about. You know, does that maybe not underestimate the fractionalization based on other attributes? You have attachment to categories, the degree to which individuals identify with categories. And so much of this is related to or based on survey research. Questions like the Marino question that asks you to sort of like assess your identity in the sort of a trade-off between, you know, two competing identities. But what if identities are not standing in a trade-off relationship? So Daniel suspects they are not, and he'll be talking a bit more about this. You have also interactions between members of groups. So this is, you know, this is where network analysis comes into play. Agent-based modeling. So network approaches have been used to explain the emergence of ethnic violence. So this is Varshny's work on civil society organizations. The regulation of ethnic conflicts, so Fearon and Layton's work on ethnic self-policing, the sources of national identity formation. So this is Andreas's social exchange theory of national identities. And in my opinion, we're at the beginning of a wave of research on using social network analysis. And then there are a lot of RCT work on this question of positive versus negative evaluation of in-groups and out-groups. And this is obviously draws on social identity theory and the contributions that have been made in sociology with respect to valence. Now, the thicker measures, so these would include meanings of identities, the content of identities. So this is, Harris actually mentioned this in his contribution. A lot of these thinner measures miss what really makes national identities unique, and that is territory. And that is homeland. And these are the kinds of things that have been talked about by the more classic scholars of ethnicity and nationalism that, again, is often missed in the kind of quantitative research that relies on these thinner measures. And then the social purposes of identity. How have identities been basically embedded in policy and political demands? And so a lot of people like Harris and me and Bochsler, right, who basically worked on quantifying qualitative data using sort of interview transcripts, using sort of the historical archival records, but these just aren't scaled up. And so this is, I just want to end on sort of a note of, you know, hope that I wish that there would be more work in quantitative research on developing thicker cross-national measures. And I think this is CATA, you know, computer-aided text analysis can get us there with word embedding techniques that Andrea suggested, textual scaling, topic modeling, how to scale this up from individual projects to kind of like larger cross-national data sets. This, I think, is an open question. And here I want to hand off to my partner in crime, Daniel.
Thank you so much. This is exactly at this point where Erin stopped, you know, when it comes to the aggregation of individual data, when it comes to the aggregation to, you know, data sets, as Erin has mentioned before, such as MARS, such as EPR, such as ethno-linguistic fractionalization, and so on and so forth. There is you know, where we would identify a major critique of the use of quantitative measures in this literature, and how we also perceive it, a misconception. So the misconception which I would like to address is that quantitative research can actually no longer deal with identities in aggregated measures, which are usually used for a lot of comparative studies. Once we accept that identities are not simple, single-dimensional, static, but that the identities have multiple layers, can be cross-cutting, are hybrid, are dynamic. And so maybe it's easy to deal with it if we have the data which we need, and both Elliott and Erin previously mentioned news sources. We can deal with it in individual data. But what do you do once you want to aggregate this for a municipality, for a society, for a group? And do we need to put everybody in a category? Look, for instance, at the very frequently used Reynolds-Querl index of ethnic polarization, ethno-linguistic fractionalization. It seems that we deal with exclusive categories there. And we believe that this would be ethically wrong. You, as a citizen, as a survey respondent, or as any type of subject of quantitative research, you should be respected for the identity or identities which you choose and which you, as a subject of research, think that they are attached to you, even if there are many of them, and even if it's complex. I can be both a German speaker, and I can also belong to a religious group. I can be both a Swiss and a European. You are allowed to be both Catalan or Spanish at the same time if you want to. We don't want to deal with these identities as being mutually exclusive. And as we now simultaneously have Ramadan and approach Orthodox Easter, you might fast with 2 in 1 for both purposes, and you can celebrate both. And not only this, you can also tell me as a researcher that you are both Muslim and observer of Orthodox Christendom. I'm a scientist. I'm not your imam to tell you whether these religions are compatible. If not, if you want to celebrate both, that's absolutely fine with me. So what do we do now? What do I do though as a social scientist once I use aggregated data, for instance, the percentage of a population or polarization indices? And here many assume that this requires mutually exclusive categories. And this is the main obstacle against quantitative research then in this perception against identities. And we believe that this is a misperception. Let me very briefly, because time is short, speak about the example of ethnic polarization, this frequently used measure. Let's take ethnic polarization, which is used as the potential for conflict, which is supposedly high if we deal with too large antagonistic groups in society. And we use the example of Belgium in our contribution. Belgium, which is a country composed of French, Dutch, and German speakers, of Catholic and Protestants. And the largest groups are the Dutch speakers and the Catholics. However, most Flemish or Dutch speakers, they are also Catholics in Belgium. And most Catholics, they are also Flemish. So you can't stage a conflict between the two largest groups in Belgium, because most of the members of this one group also belong to the other largest group. This would mean actually, that no high polarization is possible between the two largest groups in Belgium, but there are other potential geometries of conflict in Belgium. Now, thinking about reconceptualizing and reoperationalizing the concept of ethnic polarization, we would need to take into account not only the size of groups, which can be multi-layered, but also the potential overlaps between kind of, two different layers of identity. All the rest is kind of, simple math, not very complicated, kind of, the argument which we want to make, which along the kind of, case of Belgium is actually, once we start from kind of, the concepts, what ethnic polarization means, what ethnic fractionalization means, and so on, we just need to change the math of how we calculate kind of, these measures, but they are perfectly also compatible with multi-layered, complex, hybrid kind of, conceptualizations of identity. Thank you.
Should I start? Yeah, okay. To save time, let's go right into it. Thank you to Elliott for having this initiative to begin with. And thank you to everybody else who is participating and has contributed to my understanding over the years, actually, of all these phenomena. So I'm going to try, I'm going to necessarily, as Erin and Daniel also did, will refer to some parts from the exchange, but I'll try to speak a little bit more broadly, assuming that many of the people who are quite interested in this have probably already seen the piece that is open access anyways, right? So overall, I wanted to say that when it comes to measurement, it sounds like there are some things that we control as researchers, and and that's what we're discussing in a way, and there are some things we don't control. I venture say. So the things we control have to do with the things we can discuss, and I will discuss as well, and we are discussing the exchange, ontological issues, for example, what makes a group is, Brubaker's work, for example, on that. And it could be ontological issues also in the sense of what makes a unit of analysis. We talk about unit of analysis. How do we define a unit? What makes a unit? Could it be an episodic identity? Could it be a unit of analysis, right? So we can have ontological discussions, and I think we can control the answers to those discussions. Other people would say these are conceptual issues, not ontological issues. Similarly, again, we can control these conceptual discussions more. We can decide whether we believe in a Horowitz type of understanding of ethnicity, where in a way the concept it's an umbrella concept for every kind of other category in the world, more or less. Or it could be a more Chandra, let's say, approach, where you go and you're very specific about what counts as an ethnic identity, and it has to have these descent attributes or believed to be descent-based attributes and so forth. So again, these are things we can control. Operationalization issues that I know Tamara loves, and she will probably talk about. Operationalization we can control in the sense we can decide how exactly, and Daniel referred to it more specifically, I guess, we can control how we construct our algorithm or mathematical model or our survey instrument and so on and so forth to capture what we want to capture. Now, things we don't control, and maybe that comes from my experience doing more archival and historical research, have to do with the fact that we don't always have access to information, right? A lot of times we're assuming that when we're talking about ethnic or national identities, we're talking about contemporaries or people we can pick up the phone or do a survey with or something like that, but that's not always the case, right? Especially when you're dealing with people in the Balkans, for example, that early in their life, they declared themselves to be Bulgarians, and later they said, oh, I'm Greek, or then I'm something else. So how do you know if these people have passed away, which they have in historical work? How can you even measure even the episodic character, right, or the more nested, let's say, character of ethnic identities, and how these individuals make sense of these things? So that's something we don't control. So there are problems that are maybe insurmountable. Another thing that is insurmountable, and a lot of us, actually, I'm not the only one doing historical research on this panel, obviously, have dealt with, is bias. There's a lot of propaganda out there. I mean, propaganda is not something recent. Fake news is not something recent. They just didn't call it fake news. We find a lot of forged documents in archives. We find a lot of things that people wanted us to find. We don't find things we would like to have found also, which is the most obvious thing. I started with the less obvious. Often you know that governments leave things in archives because they want you to find them, and often they can even manufacture those things. That brings us to the big elephant in the room, that is politics and positionality, right? So with the things we don't control, I think the things we don't control multiply themselves when it comes to illiberal regimes, especially, and regimes that have a lot of reasons to believe that others are going to criticize them, and so on and so forth. So there is an issue that I think is structural and almost insurmountable from the researcher's perspective, with the exception maybe of some anthropologists that may be able to penetrate these type of environments. So there, I think we really need to rely quite a bit on qualitative work to overcome a lot of these issues. Now, again, this divide between quantitative and qualitative work, I think Andreas and Erin, and all of us, I think we don't really believe it. We're not a very dogmatic panel on that front. We probably won't have a very strong debate if we start this debate even. We all recognize, I think, that there's no quantitative work that does not rely on qualitative work. There's no way to generate data out of thin air. I mean, even, an algorithm will rely on some type of real world intuitions to even put it in action, right? So it's not that this divide is ironclad. Definitely the divide is important of how we analyze the data, right? And that there is no doubt about that. Interpretation is more of an important element in qualitative work, and that is, and there are a whole other host of differences, of course, but it's not that quantitative work does not have anything to do with qualitative work, as it often sounds the way that the divide is being discussed. And I know that wasn't Elliott's intention, by the way, with the title, but he wanted us to focus on the quantitative aspect of this process. So related to the regime type issue, which is a broad category, I guess you all understand what I mean by that. I wanted to, in my last 4 minutes I think I have left, to discuss the issue of positionality, which I also raise in the contribution. If I may call it a contribution, it may be a little early to call it a contribution, but in the exchange that may become a contribution to the field. And that has to do with who is the observer, right? Who is observing all this, and who? So first of all, is who is the researcher, right? Who is the observer, right? How do they and all their value judgments that go into how they've chosen to study the topic, what perspective they're taking when they're studying the topic, and what ontological priors they have when they're studying a topic, right? So that's one element of positionality that it's unavoidable that it will be there. Even just the choice of the research question, that's a huge issue to be reflective about. The second way that positionality becomes super important is once you decide what you're studying and what unit of analysis, and you settle your own value judgments and valuation processes, as Weber would call it, or Leo Strauss would call it, then the question is, what is the positionality of the people or the subjects you're studying, right? How is their reality constructed? How aware are you about their positionality, right? And that, in a way, all of those things create a reality, or what we call a reality, right? And then we present it in our books or in our statistical analysis and so on and so forth. So, if you're a government official, it's not controversial that you want to flatten ethnic diversity if your goal is to homogenize a country, right? I'm not, that's beyond normative, good or bad type of discussions. If that's your goal and that's who you are, that's how, as I'm gonna observe you as a researcher, right? Being reflective and open about this, and open to your readers about this, about your perspective and what you're studying and for what purpose, I think can clarify a lot of these misunderstandings that I think Daniel also referred to an extent. Similarly, if you're studying individual level data, or you're trying to capture the nested multiple episodic identities as a social psychologist, as Barton and his collaborators have been trying to do for a while now, and other social psychologists, which slowly political scientists are also interested in, and sociologists a lot more. That's a very different approach and very different positionality. That doesn't mean because you're doing that, that what Andreas Wimmer did in his large N work, or what other scholars, we don't need to go into name dropping here, have done, or Selway has done with his cross-cutting cleavages data set. That doesn't mean this is irrelevant or unimportant, right? Again, it goes back to who are you? What is your purpose of your research? What's your research question? Being transparent about that, and being aware of the positionality of the people who are producing your data or the subjects of your study. And I think that is a way to bridge these seeming disjunctions, let's say, in social science field right now. And I'll leave it at that and take questions later. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, first, thanks to Elliott for bringing us all together. I'm very happy to be here in this wonderful company. And I'm following up on Harris. Harris made a very important point with the positionality of the data generators, both us as social scientists, and if we use statistics and so on from governments, the governments that are involved. And one could add the individuals who respond to survey questions also have certain intentions. They want to convince the survey taker of certain things and so on. So it's basically an unavoidable, unresolvable problem. And I agree that the best way to go about this is to be reflective and conscious about what this means for the data that we are working with. So in a way, my short remarks are going to go in another direction, and I'm going to discuss different sources of data and what we can do and what we can't do, what's the advantages and disadvantages of certain sources. They all have this positionality problem that Harris has mentioned, but there's some other issues that I would like to briefly address. So one source, and Elliott has that already mentioned, is kind of big data. So it's Twitter data, it's Facebook data, it is text, it is Google searches, and so on and so on. So there's certain advantages to these kind of data over survey data or over expert codings, such as AMAR or EPR and the Soviet linguistic data and so on. So the advantage of these big data sources is that they're not produced for us, for social scientists, and that most individuals who write something on Twitter, they don't really think about how they look like in the eyes of social scientists and so on. So there's much less desirability bias in this kind of data. Most people think that they're doing this, reading this text and not another, or tweeting this and not something else. They are doing this more or less anonymously. So that is wonderful because surveys, of course, always have this problem that the responses are influenced by what the respondents think the survey takers want them to respond. And another advantage, of course, is the massive nature of these data. So you don't have sampling restrictions and so on. So it is especially if you analyze text, the world is almost endless, and every day a couple of billion more texts are digitized and so on and become accessible. But nothing comes without a price. So the price for this kind of data very often, with the exception, for example, of Facebook, is that you don't know who the people are. You have no information on the individuals. You don't know actually who reads the texts. If you study newspapers, for example, you don't know what people think if they read a newspaper. text. You don't know who has tweeted something. All you know is where they have been when they tweeted and whose other tweets they have retweeted and so on. So very often it is anonymous data, and the price for that is you don't know anything about the individual. So it has this massive restriction. So, for example, in text analysis of that is now the latest frontier. And I'm doing myself something right now on nationalism using word embeddings. So it is the best method, I think, to get at meaning. You know, what Erin has so usefully highlighted is that it's very hard to actually know what people mean when they say I'm a member, or what it means for them if they are a member of this or that ethnic or national category. So with word embeddings, you can do that. You can actually tell what's the association, the semantic associations of being Greek. What are the main associations that show up in, let's say, all the Greek newspapers over the last 150 years, and how it changes over time and how it reflects, you know, events and things like that. But you don't know anything about variation within the Greek population of what these, how these meanings could be interpreted, or how many people adhere to these meanings and so on. So that's the first source of data that has its advantages and disadvantages. The second one is more traditional, and a lot of people have talked about it already, which is surveys. And I'm sure Tamara had a lot to say about the issue of surveys. And a lot of people have talked about the problems with existing surveys, that they're not sufficiently complex. Daniel has also talked about that they're usually one-dimensional. There's the problem, I think Erin and Daniel discussed that in their contribution, that often there's forced choice. Are you an X or are you a Y? While in reality, of course, stuff is multiple and nested and so on. Then there's the problem of contexts. You know, I'm an X maybe when I go to the hospital, but I might be such as a 55-year-old man, or I might be a Y, a fellow Swiss with Daniel. So happy to discover that through your ever so slight accent that we are co-ethnics. So I might be Swiss in another context, such as when I hear Daniel speak and my heart beats faster. And so this is extraordinarily impossible to decipher and trace with surveys, because surveys are decontextualized. You know, they pretend to ask about who are you in general, and not in a specific context. So that's the usual problems with that have been discussed in the literature with surveys. But some more recent surveys that I've seen try to do this. There is survey experiments now where you can have some context, where you say, oh, imagine yourself to be in a hospital. What actually would you do if you encounter X or Y? So the survey experimental method, I think, with vignettes and things like that, is much better able to solve the context problem. And other people have developed these very complex measurement instruments that are also mentioned by Erin and Daniel and Harris in the contributions, that have multiple dimensions that are segmentally nested. So you can be German-speaking Swiss, you can be a Swiss, you can be a European, you can be a citizen of the world, and so on and so on. So all of this, I think, is moving fastly and in the right direction. What we haven't had so far, and probably among the 125 people who are listening now, there are all the heads of funding agencies, and so the following comment is addressed to them. What we haven't had so far is a true panel study in the field of ethnicity, nationalism, race, and so on. And that's kind of the gold standard. You know, if you can follow people over years and ideally over generations, then you can ask a whole set of dynamic questions. You don't have just a static comparative snapshot, but you have true dynamics of the evolution of these identities, which one become more salient under which context, how are they passed to the next generation, not passed to the next generation, and so on and so on. So something like the panel of income dynamics in the US, I'm sure I got it wrong, the precise abbreviation, the precise name of the survey, that has been running now for, I think, 30 years or 40 years and has multiple generations. I mean, that's what we need. And we should all band together and write a huge grant proposal for the European Union framework number. I don't know where we are right now, 7 or 8, I guess, and do something like that. And then our students in 20 years will be able to write papers on it. So, so the last source of data is expert surveys, where experts decide of whether this is a polarized country, not a polarized country, whether this is this identity is more politically relevant than another, and so on. And so AMAR, EPR, ethnic power relations data set, minorities at risk, and so on. These are these kind of data set. And the big advantage of this is that you can get at structural features of ethnicity, nationalism, ethnic relations, and so on, that individuals might not be aware of because they're not sociologists, they're not political scientists. So you can't ask through surveys these kind of questions. You need people who have the overview of a society and have an outside perspective and are actually able to discern things, elements of this ethnic or national reality that the individuals themselves might not have a good grasp on. And another advantage is you can do it globally. You just have to find the right people who know something about every country about the world, and this is cumbersome, but it's possible. The disadvantage, of course, is all kinds of coding biases. As Harris has said, researchers also might have an agenda, might even have a political agenda. If you ask, a Bosniak about certain things let's say in the 1980s, Yugoslavia, when it still existed, and you would ask a Albanian and a Serb, and probably these experts would portray completely different Yugoslavias that would be hard to recognize as the same country. So that's the main disadvantage there. Massive possibilities of coding bias, measurement uncertainty, and so on and so on. One usually tries to have multiple people doing the same country. They might just have the same bias. They might have the same positionality, as Harris has said, or they might have completely different biases. And then what do? You have to choose one. So it's, I think it's for, if you want to test specific theories and you need these kind of structural information on countries, it's the best way to go about, but it has its very clear limitations. So I'm going to stop here. So it's not very interesting maybe to say that, but still that's what I had to say, which is that each and every source of data has its own advantages and disadvantages. And so the obvious conclusion is what I think everybody would agree with, that triangulating, using different sources of data to get at the same questions is, of course, the gold standard, is what we should do. And sometimes it's possible to do it, and very often it is rather difficult. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I will just go straight into my comments so that we have time for questions at the end. So I first wanted to say I'm really happy to be able to comment on this exchange, and I was really excited to see it published. I also wanted to start off with two things that I think the exchange has done that other pieces that have been lamenting the topic of measurement of identity have not. And first of all, I think most of the articles that have so far tackled, to start off with, we all know that the measurement of ethnicity has been problematic, and there are all these articles saying national pride is not a good measure, this isn't a good measure, but most of these, and even the volume that has been mentioned several times, measuring identity, very frequently we're actually just talking about survey measures, right? We're criticizing survey measures, but there are also other quantitative measures that are not survey based. So I think what this exchange did really well is that it looked at, okay, what are different quantitative ways of measuring ethnicity that's not just surveys, and what are things that we can get from other places so that we're not constantly trying to use surveys. And then the second thing that I really liked is that the debate didn't set up a straw man argument. So we didn't try to say this data set is better, this method is better, but instead all of the authors focus on saying which one is better for we want high internal validity, for when we want high external validity. Are we trying to do broad comparative work, or are we trying to really understand the individual case study? And I think what we need much more of is this kind of discussion. So what can and what can't each measure do instead of setting them up in a debate with each other. So let me start off with 5 quick points I'm going to make. So the first one is this issue about how far theory has advanced on understanding ethnic identity, and then how little how not far we've come with our personalizations of it. And what we really see is frequently, this is something that Rogers Brubaker called cliched constructivism, right? So you introduce your study with a broad ontological orientation, but then when you get to the actual empirical study, you rely on data sets that just have a groupist empirical analysis, right? So what we have is a situation where we don't know how the measures actually relate to our concepts. So you have a statistical association, but you can't make a meaningful conclusion because your theoretical concept was actually not related to your empirical concept. The second issue I wanted to bring up, and I'm hoping maybe we'll have time to discuss, is this issue of individual versus group level phenomenon, right? So we know that ethnic identity includes both being grouped together in a category because you're similar to other people, like a technical classification term, but it also can mean shared collective consciousness, right? So we need to really be much more specific about saying, are we using data as descriptive categories and then grouping this data to imply a shared consciousness, or are we actually measuring something at the collective level? So this level, individual versus group level phenomenon, and what are our data actually speaking to, should be revisited. The third point is considering the data sets and measurements, and this is what I found really interesting in the exchange, because each of the people we heard about so far have different favorite data sets or different sources of data that they use. And here it seems like with survey data, we do have some that are generally more used than others, like ISSP, barometer data, world values survey, and so on. But these are the data that are restricted to surveys. What we did see from the exchange is all of the other quantitative data that we can use, like experimental methods. And this doesn't include, so Andreas mentioned some of the experimental methods, but they also include things like, putting people from different groups and having to divide up resources, right? And we know, of course, that this has low external validity, but still these experimental methods have come a long way. And we don't seem to use them very much. And especially, I'm a sociologist, especially in sociology, we tend to really, really kind of turn our nose at experimental methods, but there's a lot that has been done there. Then we have the expert coding that's been mentioned many times, naturally occurring data that Andreas mentioned, like Twitter, Facebook, Google searches, social networks. We haven't talked a lot about social networks, but social network data could actually give us really, really interesting things. And this was especially great in the times of Facebook, when you could actually get the data to see who is actually friends with whom and according to what characteristics. Then one of the things that wasn't mentioned so much in the exchange, but quantitative content analysis, right? So text analysis of, let's say, textbooks. So not just internet things, but printed material. So textbooks, magazines, and so on. And then also observational aggregate measures of behavior, right? So voting, violence, protest, segregation, hiring, marriages. So all of these other measures of behavior that we can actually get without having to ask people to report on their behavior. And the thing that Andreas actually mentioned in his piece was that it's a trade-off, and it's always a trade-off. And this is what I hope really comes clear in the discussion at the end, is that everyone here has been talking about trade-offs and what we can get from each thing. So really quickly, then I want to move on to the fourth point, which is the main thing that I wanted to share for today, which is what are we actually measuring, right? So what are we trying to measure? And Erin actually talked about this in depth in in her opening remarks, what are we measuring? So with my colleague Elena Gajanova, we actually tried to, a couple of years ago, say what is a conceptual component and what is operationalization, right? So first you have the ethnic self-identification, which you can get from census categories, or you can simply ask people, how do you identify? And this is much better for using, if we need ethnicity to be the independent variable. So how does ethnicity affect economic growth, public goods provision, emergence of violence, right? So simply self-identification. But to be clear again here that we're using self-identification and we're not just aggregating this into group level variable. The second one is this feeling of belonging and groupness. And these are the ones that political scientists seem to use the most. So this linked fate. So how much do you feel like your fate is linked to the fate of your co-ethnics? Or feelings of attachment, how strongly do you feel attached to a particular group? So this is the groupness and attachment to the actual category. Then we get to the third conceptual component, which is the content of the identity, which is what Bars called the cultural stuff. And we tend to not really want to go into this, right? Because if we go into this, we risk being primordialist or trying to really explain, the cultural meaning of a category. So Andreas, in one of his earlier things, said, let's actually look at where the boundaries are and not engage in actually trying to explain what's inside. And here you can actually use cognitive mapping and content analysis, right? So that there are quantitative measures we can use for this as well. Then we move on to attitudes. And here we have things like pride. So how proud are you to be Serbian, or how much pleasure do you derive from your belonging to your group? And these come from social identity theory and this kind of sense of positive or negative identification, which could also be social distance, prejudice, and so on. And then finally, we get behavior that we haven't talked too much about, but this is things that you can actually get from what are people doing based on their ethnic identity, their choice of area of residence, their friendships, their marriages, their participation in clubs, religious affiliations. So these are usually, again, in surveys self-reported, but we can get this data aggregate data. The only problem with behaviors is that they are usually very culturally specific. So it's hard to actually come up with data we can actually compare across different countries because the behaviors tend to be group specific. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about, or actually ask maybe the speakers to mention, is this fifth point, which is we have kept saying ethnic identity, but I know that some of the visitors here today want to know how is this different from national identity, or how is this different from nationalism. So there's just an article published a few weeks ago in Ethnopolitics that's called How Should We Measure Nationalist Sentiments? And it actually argues that national identification or national identity comes on one end, and it actually is a gradient that goes on to national consciousness, patriotism, pride, superiority, nationalism, right? And I'm not offering this. This is Natalia Kasianenko. It's not my argument. But the thing that I wanted to raise was, how do we feel? I mean, what are the perceptions on what is the theoretical difference between ethnic identity and national identity and nationalism? Because we tend, even in the exchange and even in my remarks today, we grouped all of them together, right? So what are the distinctions, and what can we say about measurement of ethnic identity versus national identity versus nationalism? And maybe if we have time, the fifth point is a thing that we talked about the least, so we can get back to that. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you to all of you, all five of you, for speaking so concisely, and also, I think, generating quite a bit of debate. I'm going to go straight into the questions. We've got about 10 minutes, or a little bit less than 10 minutes. I'm going to throw out some questions and see if anybody wants to take them up, and if they do, then just jump in. And if not, then I'll move down to the next one. So the first question we've got here is from Edward in Indonesia. I'm guessing this is going to be a bit tricky to answer. A question about quantitative or qualitative research on ethnic or national identities in Asian context or Southeast Asian context. Anybody want to jump in? I do think that we don't, if we had somebody like Professor Kachin Chandra on the panel, we might be better off. But right now, I'm not sure the expertise is very high on that. But does anybody want to jump in on that? No? Okay, I'm going to move on to a question from Edward on Facebook. And that's a question about, interesting question about the degree to which we have a concentration here on the panel, especially from sociologists and political scientists. And the question about why we might not have more questions, a speaker from social psychology. it's a question to me, but does anybody else want to jump in? No.
I mean, we mentioned a lot of work by social psychologists, but yeah, we could have had. That's the simple answer.
Yeah, I mean, my answer as the organizer is that, I think part of it is about the sort of networks that exist within the study of ethnicity and nationalism. I think that sociology and political science, those who study the topic from those two disciplines, we tend to interact quite a bit. There is, of course, a lot of works published in Nations and Nationalism across a variety of disciplines, including history, and social psychology is of course present there. There are social psychologists publishing in the journal. It just tends to be, I think, more a matter of the disciplinary boundaries that exist within academia, unfortunately, than the nature of the study of ethnicity and nationalism. I should mention, by the way, of course, there's a lot of interesting work on this topic. It reminds me of Henry Hale's book on ethnic politics, where he discusses the literature on social psychology quite extensively in that book. Andreas, did you have a point?
Yeah, I wanted to just add one, what I perceive as a paradigmatic difference between how social psychologists usually do it and how other social scientists usually do it. And one of the features of the social psychological approach is, of course, that they do experiments, and almost exclusively, and in the vast majority of experiments, it's always clear who the groups are. It's part of the experimental design. It's hardwired into a social psychological understanding of these questions, that who is the in-group and who is the out-group is never the outcome to be studied, but it's always the input. It's part of the experimental design. And they have generated massive amounts of truly interesting insights of how in-group, out-group dynamics are evolving, but very little actually which would speak to the crucial question that we are concerned, which is what are actually the groups that are relevant? Who is the in-group? Who is the out-group? For whom? And how that changes over time. So there's some limits of compatibility in the overall ontology within which these different disciplines are operating.
Thanks for that. I'm going to go to the next question from Zora Popova. A question about, according to the Council of Europe, Article 3, belonging to an ethnic group or minority is voluntary. So how do we, she says, how does the qualitative approach address this problem? I think she might mean how does the quantitative approach address this problem with shifting and multiple identities? To what degree identity is voluntary when we think about quantitative approaches? Daniel?
Well, thanks for the question. I don't see it as a particular problem. The kind of, identity is in this context, voluntary as of when it's expressed towards the state. You might also detach how people register with the state from the identities which they would inform you about in one way or the other way, through a survey, through an experiment, through a qualitative interview. These might be two different concepts. I think moving further from this question, also we could also ask whether somebody can at the same time belong to several different minorities, or whether this also implies that we need to belong to one single minority. I wouldn't know a single state which but I'm happy about examples. I wouldn't know a single state which allows the same person to belong to several minority groups. Though I think there would be very relevant cases for that. For instance, in Southeast Europe, you would have a lot of Roma minorities who in minority-dominated places would speak minority languages, or to bring in a third Swiss after Andreas and me. Maybe I've read by Nenad Stojanovic, who is also politically active and represents the the southern Italian-speaking Ticino region, and so he is a lobbyist for a linguist minority in Switzerland. But at the same time, he is also, as you could guess from his name, a Yugoslav migrant. And I couldn't make any of the claim whether he is more Ticino, means Italian speaking, or more Yugoslav. He is both, and he should have the right to both. And I would be curious to see whether there is any state which does such an interpretation of minority rights and would allow people such as Mylonas to belong to two different minorities.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to a question from Pablo on Facebook. I asked a question earlier to the panel about Asia or Southeast Asia, but this is a question about Latin America. And here I think I'm going to direct the question to Andreas, who's done some work on Latin America, if you want to tackle that, Andreas.
Sorry, what's the question exactly?
Basically, again, to what degree that we can talk about quantitative analysis of identity in Latin America specifically, since we haven't really discussed it in the panel so far.
Oh, I mean, there's a huge tradition in Latin America of studying ethnic politics, national identity, and so on. So Pablo, if you want to send me an email, I can just reply to you with some of the core work in this area.
Okay. Does anybody yeah,
Elliott, can I mean, a lot of these regional specific discussions, obviously all the cross-national work includes all these areas of the world, right? So a lot of our comments are actually talking about how a colleague, you know, like Andreas would go with his team and decide which groups to count in any country in the world, right? So all of our comments are actually applicable to Latin America, to Indonesia, to India. Now, whether you like it or not, the coding, that's something we're discussing right now, actually, whether we think this is appropriate, accurate, or what have you, right? So from that perspective, all the cross-national quantitative research you asked us to kind of discuss or comment on is not excluding these areas of the world. So it's different if we want something specific. That was Andreas's answer. Whether we want something, whether they're asking whether these areas are covered by what we're discussing. They're already covered by the ELF, the EPR dataset, the Uppsala dataset, and so on and so forth. So, but my problem is that we are not talking about other types of emissions. So, for example, the smaller scale emissions, like the groups below 1% type of emissions, or all the silences in these data sets, which are not at the level of the region, they're at the level of the, the groupings, or in what we could call methodological nationalism, as Andreas has put it in the past, or census nationalism, where we reify categories that are actually state categories and so on. For that's a different problem. That is not the region-specific problem necessarily. Some regions have this problem more pronounced, maybe because of regime type, maybe because of all sorts of structural reasons, right? I'm not denying that, but they're covered from Andreas and other big projects, dataset projects.
Andreas, quickly, yes, please come in.
I think that's a really great comment. And I would like to add to that, there's this massive bias that we never study ethnic groups or nationalities that disappeared, that just the identities that dissolved. And so there's a massive selection on the dependent variable problem in all the data. And somebody should put together, with the help of another European Union framework funding, all the ethnic communities in the last 100 or 200 years. I'm thinking, I don't have the time to go into examples that no longer exist. That would be a terrific project.
More funding opportunities. I think we should. That's the conclusion. The real conclusion is we need to apply for more grants. I think that's the conclusion from the panel. We have hit over an hour, and that's the time that we are allotted today. So I'm going to unfortunately bring this to a close. But I would encourage other people who have questions, as Andreas just mentioned, to please email all of us or individually. We'd be happy to engage with you more in the future. Thank you for all coming to today's event. We really hope you enjoyed it. This recording will be available on Facebook and YouTube for about a week, and then it will be available on the members area of the ASEN website, along with recordings of the past ASEN events, and you're most welcome to go on to the website to look on how to become a member. Just to repeat, this was published, this is an exchange that was published earlier this year in the Journal of Nations and Nationalism. It is open access, and our administrator has put the link here in the Zoom chat if you'd like to follow up on that. Again, that's open access, meaning it's free to access. You don't have to pay the publisher an exorbitant amount of money. So thanks again to everybody, and I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you all for joining. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.